Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Peace, brother Achilles. I'm testing here. I haven't used this whole setup before, so I'm trying to figure it all out. Achilles. Peace, brother Shaka Ra. Yeah, I'm muted. Y'all give me a thumbs up if y'all can hear me. I just want to make sure that y'all can y'all can hear me before I get started. Don't want to lose nobody. All right, cool, cool. That's solid. That's what I like to hear. 1 second. Trying to get the situation. So this is my first time actually using this whole setup. So y'all gonna have to bear with me. I think with Zoom there's like a 10-second delay between me talking and YouTube actually getting it on the stream. So please just bear with me. Peace, Black Mariner. Should have a good topic for y'all today, but let me share this onto my Twitter before I get started. I feel like a novice. I swear I haven't done this in a minute. All right, how do I share? Share onto Twitter. All right, I just shared that. Hold on 1 second. Let me share my screen with y'all. This is all so complicated. All right. Share my screen. All right, cool. Y'all should see my screen. I'm going to pop that right up there in the corner. All right. Who all we got in the building so far? Let me pull it up on my phone just so I can see what the count is looking like. All right, I got 4 folks in here. That's cool. I just shared it on Twitter. Oh man, how y'all been, man? Brother Shaka Ra, how's everything over in the UK with this COVID-19? Actually, Brother Shaka Ra, I'm gonna share the link with you to let me hold on. I'm gonna hide my screen real quick. And Brother Shaka Ra, Brother Akili, I'm gonna share the link with y'all just in case um y'all wanna join at some point to have like a real conversation. So hold on 1 second. I'm gonna send it to y'all. I'm gonna DM it to y'all on Twitter. All right. So just give me 1 second. I'm about to DM y'all right now. Boom. Just sent it to you, Brother Shaka Ra, Brother Akili. I want to send it to you too. Just check your DM on Twitter. All right, I guess I got to find you a different way. Hold on 1 second. I feel super slow right now. All right, there you go, brother. Send this to your DM. All right, boom. Just sent that to both of y'all DM. All right, that's cool, brother. You can take your time. Now, all right, let me share my screen again. All right, cool. All right, I'm gonna start real quick by just showing y'all. Before I get into the actual lecture, I want to give folks a few minutes to get in so y'all can catch it from the beginning. I haven't done one of these in a while. If you're new here, please do like, subscribe to the channel. Feel free to comment, and engage with any other videos that are on the channel. I'm gonna go ahead and share this with a couple of people while we waiting here. But while we waiting, I want to show y'all a trailer. Y'all know I started this series back in February, on the 2nd of February, called the Strike Drum Lecture Series. So we've already given 4 of the lectures in that series, so there's 2 more to go. But if you'd like to purchase any of the digital recordings or the slides from the series, you can definitely reach out to me by email to get any of the material from any of the lectures. I did post the first lecture in the series on my YouTube page for free. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Black America and the Black Immigrant Paradox, so definitely go check it out. But I'm going to play a quick trailer for y'all to check out. All right, here we go.
Strike Drum, the political awakening of African consciousness, a 6-part African Renaissance lecture series by Omawale Africa.
He don't come across as preaching. He come across as if he's having a conversation with you. And in my opinion, from my perspective, I feel like that's the best orator style to have.
My dad asked me to watch the lecture, and I was like, okay. And then I watched the lecture, and I was like, okay.
I definitely feel like the information was well researched. I can tell he did his homework. He definitely taught me things that I wasn't aware of. So yeah, great job, great job.
There were a few parts that I had to go to my dad about, but I really liked it.
This can be something that you can watch with the whole family and your kids, because that's something that we all should know. And it's a great way to teach your kids and help them understand our history.
Brother Omawale, thank you for Strike Drum.
All right. So that being said, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna get started with the lecture. I trust that everybody can see my screen here. Give me a second. There we go. You see? All right, boom. So, peace to the chat. Peace, Sister Adjua. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with this presentation. It's going to be more of a conversation, but I definitely have some slides here to help walk me through this conversation, because there's definitely points that I want to make sure that I am covering. Funny enough, I actually did this presentation about maybe like a week and a half ago. Been in a house for like the last 2 weeks. In a minute, I'm about to get some braids. I ain't been in a barber shop in like 3 weeks. Got this this cough that just won't go away, so I might have got a little COVID going on over here. But no, in all seriousness, I I started this presentation. I completed or created this presentation about 2 weeks ago. It was around the time, I think it was like Super Tuesday, and I was looking at like a lot of the commentary online just surrounding the elections here in the U.S. And people's thoughts, on the elections and the different candidates. And I think it was Dr. Jared Ball. I think he had tweeted something, and I engaged with him on the tweet. He had tweeted something about we here in the U.S. or Black people, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically stated that Black people have yet to um, implement Malcolm X's solutions in terms of organizing politically and running our own candidates, creating our own political parties, so that we can engage politically within this particular system here. And my reply to that, and I'm paraphrasing my own reply because I tweeted it. I tweeted it at him. Like I said, like a week or two ago. But my reply was that um, the vote today for people in any of these democracies or so-called democracies worldwide, because if you know anything about me, you know that I don't believe in voting. I believe that when people talk about their democratic ideals and their democratic principles, it's more of what Mama Marimba Ani refers to as a rhetorical ethic, meaning these are just statements meant to disarm you, statements that sound good on paper, but cannot be operationalized in reality. And when you actually take these statements as truth or as fact, you really just set yourself up to be a more easier victim. You understand what I'm saying? So, I don't believe in the concept of American democracy. And even, when the Europeans in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome were pontificating about, so-called democratic ideals, even at that time, 80% of their population were enslaved, right? So from the very beginning, coming out of Europe, this concept of democracy was always a flawed notion, and it never was meant to apply to the population, to the general population. It certainly didn't include those folks who were enslaved or subjected to the empire. It only meant those folks who were the, landed and propertied class of that particular population. You understand what I'm saying? So for me, knowing these things and understanding that history, I don't have any faith in any American democracy or any Western democracy or any other form of, so-called democracy or democratic rule. But I recognize that a lot of people who follow me and who engage with me, they do. And many of them, are engaged in this thought process that they can, reform or transform the political state, here in the West. And I'm not of that mind. But I did just want to have a conversation tonight. So I titled this particular presentation, and this is when I had originally created it. The title of it was "The Russian Boogeyman and the Assault on American Populism." And the subtext was the poison pill in American democracy, right? So I hope to really discuss that through tonight's presentation. Peace, Sister Zakia. Appreciate you for joining. But yeah, I hope to discuss that in tonight's presentation and conversation that I really want to have with the family here. So that being said, I'm going to get started. As you all know, I'm currently in the middle of a fundraiser. I shared the trailer to the Strike Drum lecture series to start off this presentation tonight. But this particular fundraiser, I'm raising funds to cover the travel expense for travel to Brazil. Afrocentricity International has our international conference every year, either somewhere in the diaspora or on the African continent. And in 2020, uh, it's going to be in Brazil, and I'm looking to give a presentation there. So the lectures that I've been giving, throughout the winter and the spring, I'm making digital recordings of those lectures available for sale. So if you'd like to purchase any of the lectures or the slides related to the lectures, you can always reach out to me by email at omowalespeaks@gmail.com. Or if you'd like to just give a donation to support this effort, you can always give donations via PayPal or via Cash App. My cash tag at Cash App is hashtag or Cash App, established in 1984. Brother Akili, you just have to go to YouTube and just press. There should be an icon there for you to share the YouTube uh, video. But yeah, thank you for sharing. If all y'all can. Also, if you follow me on Twitter, I just tweeted a link to the live, so you can always retweet the link as well, and people can join that way. Um, but that being said, let me go ahead and get started. And y'all forgive me, I might be sipping water a lot through this presentation because I literally, like, before this whole COVID-19 thing got all crazy, like, we had the flu kind of like run through our house, like towards the end of February, and it was vicious. But ever since, like, we all got over the flu, literally my wife, my youngest daughter who's one, and me, we all caught it. But I have like this stubborn dry cough that just like won't go away. So I find that even when I'm talking for long periods of time, like, the cough, or like it just bothers me. So if y'all hear me having to pause to take a sip of water, I just ask that y'all forgive me. um okay, but as I stated, so this presentation tonight, I said that, Dr. Jared Ball had posted something on his page a couple of weeks ago. I think it was after the Super Tuesday when Bernie lost really bad in Michigan. But he had posted, that black people have yet to take Malcolm up on his position, as it relates to, organizing political candidates and giving them a black agenda, and creating a political party for us to engage with this particular system. And for me, I kind of pushed back on him when he said that. I retweeted with the comment that, the vote today in any of these democracies is the equivalent of, I used an analogy. I said it's like when you're playing a video game and you have like your little brother or your little sister beside you, sometimes you'll give them a remote control that's not actually, plugged into the console. And, you give them that control so that, they won't throw a temper tantrum, right? So they think that they're playing with you, but really that the control, the remote that you just gave to them isn't really hooked up to the console, but you've now appeased them and they think, that they are engaging. And I equated the vote to that. The elite give the masses of people in America and all across this globe, the illusion that they are participating in some type of democracy. They give them the illusion that their vote actually like matters, right? Because even if we all went out and voted, like, who's to say that the polling systems here are not going to be, manipulated by those who control it? But be that as it may, I don't even want to get into speculation with this particular presentation. I only want to deal with the fact, right? I only want to deal with facts, and I'm going to prove and show to our folks tonight that, when they give you the vote, what they're doing is they're giving you the equivalent of me giving my younger brother or younger sister, the remote, to a console that's not, hooked up. So they think that they're playing, but they're not really playing. So it's the same thing with us, right? We're we're voting, right? We think we're participating in some type of democracy. We think that we're participating in this ritual of the so-called transfer of power, but really all it is to just appease us, to rock us to sleep, and to keep us maintained with the status quo, right? This is the way that the elite want us to engage politically. This is the way that the elite tell us that we get change in society. It's done through the vote, right? And I think, where our political maturity was, 50 or 60 years ago, that may have made sense. But, over the past 50 to 55 years, the 55 years since Malcolm has been assassinated, a lot of things have changed. The terrain has changed. And I think that when we give analysis today, especially political analysis, we have to consider the changes that have occurred in the terrain. So what I want to start with is Malcolm. This isn't from his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. This is from a speech that he gave in 1964. This was in December of 1964, so about 2 months before his assassination. And Fannie Lou Hamer had also shared the platform with him. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer, our ancestor from Mississippi, who was one of the founders of the Freedom Now. I think it was the Freedom Now. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Y'all can put it in the chat, but I think it was the Freedom Now Democratic Party, or the Mississippi Democratic Party, whatever it was. They attempted to establish a political party for that had a black agenda for our people, for the purpose of engaging with this particular system, right? To have an alternative, right, to the Democratic Party. But Malcolm, he gave these remarks during this presentation, and the reason why I'm sharing this particular presentation, and I want you all to go and check it out, right? Because I don't want you to take my word for anything. If you just Google, Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm X speak in Harlem, New York, 1964, you'll find this website. It's on HarlemWorldMagazine.com. And you can literally go and listen to the speech that Malcolm gives. But this entire speech, Malcolm reiterates over and over that the only way for Black people to obtain their liberation is either through the ballot or through the bullet. And he meticulously, or he uses like copious examples, right, to reason with our folks throughout the speech, to basically say it's not going to be done through the ballot. I think this is what people miss about this particular lecture or speech that Malcolm has given, right? He's saying to them, hey, the only way we're going to get our freedom is through the ballot or the bullet, right? That's how he starts it. And then the whole body of the presentation is him just giving you example after example after example of why it won't be done through the ballot, right? So if he's saying that it's only A or B, and A isn't viable, then that only leaves you with B, right? It only leaves you with the bullet, right? And in the presentation, he's saying, we need our own, Mau Mau here in America. He's referring to the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, that was a revolutionary grassroots army that was put together to engage using armed struggle the colonial government of Kenya. And he's saying, we need that here in America, right? And even that, made sense 55 years ago. There were a lot of our ancestors who engaged here in America in armed struggle and revolutionary struggle. A lot of our ancestors were forced into exile. A lot of them were forced underground. And we have political prisoners to this day that are still incarcerated, still being unjustly held by this country for the fact that they chose to fight. You understand what I'm saying? Malcolm was assassinated, Martin was assassinated, and Martin wasn't even on, the revolutionary tip in terms of armed struggle, but Malcolm was. So I'll just read a quote from this, and then I'm going to move on. So here's a quote from the speech. Malcolm says, "There's only one way to be free. It's not something that someone gives to you, it's something that you take. We don't yet realize the price necessary to pay to see that these things are enforced where we're concerned." He's talking about civil rights at this time. He's saying that we as a people don't understand the price that we must ultimately pay to actually obtain our civil or our human rights, right? He says, and until we realize this, they won't be enforced where we're concerned. We have to let the people in Mississippi, as well as in Mississippi, New York, and elsewhere know that freedom comes to us either by ballots or by bullets. That's the only way freedom is gotten. Freedom is gotten by ballots or by bullets. These are the only two avenues, the only two roads, the only two methods, the only two means, either ballots or bullets, right? So this is Malcolm stressing to them that, hey, these are our only two avenues to obtain our independence, our liberation, our sovereignty, our dignity, our human rights as a people. These are our only two options, right? And if you go and listen to the speech, all throughout the speech, he's telling you option A isn't viable. Go listen to it. Don't just take my word. And if you disagree with me, I open that up to anyone. If anyone disagrees with me, I'm open to debate this point, because I don't necessarily believe that what he was saying was subject to interpretation. But if you do happen to have a different interpretation, if your reason or your logic, leads you to believe that he was saying something else, I'm open to engage with anyone on this particular topic. But Again, I want you to all go and listen to the speech for yourself, because when you listen to the speech and he's telling you that we need our own Mao Mao, right? We need our own armed struggle. He's basically letting you know that, okay, the ballot ain't working, it's going to be the bullet. Okay, perfectly fine. That's where we were, 55 years ago. I mean, we can even make the argument, for argument's sake, we can even say that the ballot may have not even worked then. You understand what I'm saying? But okay. Um, 55 years ago, this notion of armed struggle is something that a lot of us were taking very serious. But when you look at where we are now, 55 years later, and a lot of the changes that have occurred, right? The government that we are up against today is not the same government, that Malcolm and his contemporaries were up against, right? The government, in terms of its military apparatus, its surveillance apparatus, is 100 times larger. This nation has been incredibly militarized. Its internal spying mechanisms is like, if you think about, COINTELPRO back then, what it is today is like, it's a whole different monster. This is what we're faced with today. So like the idea of armed struggle, at least here in America, right, as African Americans, the idea of us obtaining our independence right now through armed struggle, I don't know if that's necessarily feasible where we are today. As a people, we are a lot more disorganized. I think that there's a great deal of political confusion. There's so much fragmentation that has occurred. Our organizational apparatus and our institutional apparatus is very fragmented at the grassroots level. So even if we wanted to engage in that way, at most, if any of us as individuals decided to take that route, then we end up as kind of like lone wolves, for a lack of a better term. And does that work? I don't know. Like I'm of the proponent that it's definitely, good to hit back when you're being hit. I think that you should definitely instill, some fear in the people who are hitting you, to let them know that there's going to be a penalty, for what they done do to you. The same will be done to them. So I'm okay with that. But when we have the big picture in mind, which is our freedom, our liberation, our sovereignty, sometimes we have to sacrifice the more immediate need for immediate gratification, as in going out and hitting somebody or killing somebody, and we have to strategize and plan for, what do things look like in the long run. And when we deal with the long run, we have to deal with the long run within a particular context, right? So even if you look at the US empire right now, you look at the economic system that dominates the world right now being capitalism, it's all in a state of crisis. And the US empire, in my opinion, which is based on facts and observation and analysis of other empires at the end of their road, the US empire seems to be in a state of ruin, and some would even say, is in a state of, imminent collapse. So with that being said, like, what do our politics need to look like in that situation? Right, in a situation where the status quo is not going to be maintained, in a situation where we may have a future that, if you look at like the disruption of today with things like the COVID-19 virus and how it has disrupted your everyday life, in a collapsing society, like what does that world look like, and what type of worldview do you need to have as a people to survive as a society in ruin? Right, because what we don't want to occur is for us as Black people to remain disorganized and still trying to integrate into this burning building. And now, not only is the building burning, it's collapsing. So now we're saying, you know what? Okay, let's step outside. Get our breath for a second. We're going to form a political party, and we're going to take this political party, instead of running into this burning building, now we're going to run into this building that's collapsing. Like that's the logic that I hear basically when people say, we need to form some type of political party to like engage with this particular system, a system that is in disarray, a system that does not exist in alignment with nature, a system that is not sustainable, and a system that is headed for collapse. Right, so our politics need to be more trained towards that, right? The survival of our people, the preparation of our people in heading into these times. Um, But again, that's just kind of like my opening remarks that I wanted to give y'all. I'm sharing right here. This is a good image. We had a online general membership meeting at AI Philly this past Sunday, and one of the brothers, brother Quaju, at the end of the meeting shared this particular proverb, the proverb of the chicken and the roach, or the unity of the chicken and the roach. And basically, with this, I'll read it here because it's a pretty cool cartoon. But it says, "The unity of the chicken and the roach happens in the belly of the chicken." It's a Haitian proverb, and in the belly you see the roach, and the roach is saying, "I'm planning to change the system from the inside." You know, and he shared this with us to say that that's we are the roach, and we're saying that, you know, we're going to go into the belly of this beast, right, into the belly of American capitalism, or into the belly of so-called American democracy with a political party, and change the system from the inside. You know, we are as insane as the roach who's attempting to go into the belly of the chicken to overthrow the chicken from the inside. You understand what I'm saying? So I guess the good news, and it depends on if you want to look at it as good news, is that the chicken, meaning American democracy, American capitalism, American society, is collapsing, right? So as the so-called proverbial roaches, right? We don't necessarily need to go inside the chicken. We need to, you know, get out of the chicken's way and let the chicken go ahead and collapse. And we need to be over here building, right, with this, and what we need to be building. We can discuss that. That's a discussion for another time. But right now, I really just want to get into this particular presentation. Right. So I've given you all my opening remarks. I've talked about kind of like, you know, what was my reasoning for wanting to give this presentation. So I have a couple of, like I said, this is really going to be a conversation, but it's going to be a conversation that's based on facts. Like, I want to share information, and the purpose, again, always the purpose of sharing information is not for us to have information for information's sake. It's so that we can have better inputs, right, into our analysis, so that we can develop better solutions and better strategies to deal with the situations that we are faced with as a people. Right, so I've given you the opening remarks. I believe on Twitter I titled this particular presentation Malcolm X and the Neoliberal Assault on Democratic Rule. Right, so what I'm going to do tonight, or this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are, is I'm going to talk briefly just about the dawn of American neoliberalism. Um, Neoliberalism is a global project, though, but I'm going to talk tonight within the context of America. I'm going to talk about the Hamilton Project, which a lot of us may not be familiar with, but it's a neoliberal project. I'm going to talk about what I refer to as the Goldman Democrats. People oftentimes mischaracterize them as so-called Clinton Democrats or New Democrats, but I like to refer to them as the Goldman Democrats, and I'll explain during the presentation why. And then I'm going to talk about alternatives to voting, right? Because some of the critiques that I get back from folks sometimes is that, hey, you know, you give a lot of information, the information is good, but what are the solutions? My answer to that is always, as our ancestor Kwame Ture said, the solution is to organize, organize, organize. But also, if you pay close attention, the solution is also in the analysis. You know what I mean? So you should be listening for solutions when you hear the presentation. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Again, if you're just joining us, the official name for the presentation is The Russian Boogeyman and the Assault on American Populism. The subtext of this particular presentation tonight is the poison pill in American democracy, or so-called American democracy. As I've already explained, democracy does not truly exist in America or any other modern nation today. Um, all right, so start here with a quote from Samuel P. Huntington. He sat on the National Security Council for President Carter. So back in the 80s, he also wrote a very popular book called The Clash of Civilizations. He's a political science professor, or was a political science professor up at Harvard. I believe he's still living. So, but I don't think he no longer teaches at Harvard. But the first time I heard of this gentleman was in a lecture that Dr. Amos Wilson uh, gave. The lecture was given like back in the early 90s, but I saw it on YouTube, of course, in the 2000s. But Dr. Amos Wilson talked about his book, and talked about the importance of Pan-Africanists studying some of the political works that are being put out by these Europeans who are attempting to extend their world order and attempting to extend their domination over the globe, over the indigenous people of the globe, and also over our resources. So it's definitely a good book to read if you have not read it. If you have been attending my lectures for the Strike Drum lecture series, you may know that I started off that series with a quote from Mama Marimba Ani, who had stated in her book Urugu that in order to teach, Pan-African studies well, or to give a proper Pan-Africanist analysis, she says that you must teach European studies and African studies simultaneously, right? So, when I'm giving you information, I'm always giving us stuff for us as African people to put into our own inputs for political analysis, but I'm giving you a lot of information about your opponent. You understand what I'm saying? So you aren't confused or distracted or disoriented by their tactics, right? So I'm going to start here with this quote from Samuel P. Huntington. He says, "You may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. That is what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine." So why am I starting with this quote? What I have highlighted here in red is the part of the quote that says, "Create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union or Russia that you are fighting." And the reason why I'm starting with this quote is because uh, there were two populist movements that emerged in this country during the 2010s. At the beginning of the 2010s, you had a movement called the Tea Party, and you had a movement called the Occupy Wall Street. Both of these movements, in their own ways, were a response to economic uncertainty here in America, but also a response to decades of neoliberal policy that have pretty much left them out to dry. Right? These are your white American neighbors who are starting to feel the brunt of these new policies, and they don't like the niggerization of whiteness. They don't like the situation that currently exists where there's not much difference between them and the black folk. We as black people in this country have always experienced neoliberal policies, but with neoliberal policies being broad-based and now impacting the white masses, you see these movements emerge. At the beginning of the 2010s. On the left, it'd be the Occupy Wall Street, and on the right, you see the Tea Party movement. Now, in the 2016 election, both of these populist movements would give rise to two populist candidates. So the Tea Partiers, would be represented by Donald Trump's candidacy, and the Occupy folks would be represented by the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. Now, when you look at the right, Donald Trump was able to surmount all of the establishment candidates on the Republican side, and the Republican Party was not able to protect itself from Donald Trump. So ultimately, he became the Republican nominee. On the so-called political left here in America, the populist movement did not fare so well. The Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, really coalesced to protect the establishment candidate using, tactics such as their super delegates, using corporate media. They found a way to shut out the populist candidate. And as a result of them shutting out the populist candidate and running, the establishment or Goldman Democrat against the populist candidate, they got bludgeoned. They got beat to death. In that 2016 election. Trump really wiped the floor with the candidate who was then Hillary Rodham Clinton. And immediately the next day after that election, in order for the establishment to give themselves cover, right, for the fact that they had manipulated Democratic primary process, for the fact that they had what's the word I'm looking here for the fact that they had subverted, right, the so-called democratic will of the people and put forth a candidate that the people did not want, and that candidate lost badly. They started running with this narrative that uh, the reason why Hillary Clinton, lost the election is because the Russians, right, the Russian boogeyman, got involved and started, spreading, misinformation, and making Americans discontent, and to, making Americans more polarized, right? So this has been a motto, not a motto. That's not the proper word to use here, but basically the that was the talking point, right, from all of corporate media following the election, with the exception of maybe Fox News or the so-called media on the on the right side of American democracy, because they were happy with the candidate. But all of your liberal media, MSNBC, CNN, Bloomberg, whatever, all of them were a buzz with, these Russians have, you know infiltrated and interfered in American democracy. And again, the Russian boogeyman, again, I shared this quote here to start, just to say that the use of the Russian boogeyman has went back to like the days literally of Garvey, right? When black people were organizing in the early 1900s, the U.S. government was like, the Negroes are seeing red, like this whole like red baiting, So this is something we've seen throughout the 20th century. So it should surprise none of us that we also see it in the 21st century, where the establishment is using, so-called, this idea of this Russian boogeyman to give themselves cover. Their candidate didn't lose because Russia interfered with the election. Their candidate lost because it was a long-standing populist movement that had been responding to decades of neoliberal policy in America. And when they see themselves at risk of being starved out, economically, as wealth is being calcified at the top among the 1%, they're going to respond to that. And they're going to want populist initiatives, and they're going to want things from the government to give them some type of assurity as a people that they are going to be protected, and they're not going to be left out to die, left out to, to basically, without any economic opportunity, just, go crawl into a hole somewhere and, starve, essentially, right? So this whole notion of some type of Russian boogeyman, and that got involved and infected us, and interfered, like it's nonsense. And to be quite frank, I literally, I write people off, and I don't care who you are. I don't care how much respect I have for you. My respect for you as an African-centered scholar is one thing, but politically, if I hear you using, the Russian boogeyman, I automatically write you off, because it tells me right away that you're tapped in to the mainstream media loop, and you're using their same talking points. And it's especially a slap in the face when it comes to so-called African Americans or Africans in this country, right? For them to say that, because essentially when they say that Russians got in black people's heads, what it's saying is that black people would be content and happy slaves if it wasn't for those pesky Russians letting them know that that racism exists in America, and if it wasn't for those pesky Russians letting them know that the police are killing them in America, black people would be content. But because those Russians got on social media and capitalized off of American racism, black people have been discontented in this country. And it's a slap in the face. Anybody who's black and somebody brings some Russian nonsense to you, you should just look at them like they're crazy. Like, I don't need the Russians to tell me what it means to be black in America. You know what I mean? But it's an insult to my intelligence to think that, I would be just fine with the way things are if it weren't for these Russians getting involved and telling me not to vote. Like, for me as an individual, I'll tell you now, my own personal perspective. I was the dude out in 2008 down in DC, really happy, with the election, with the Cinderella event of the first black president. You know what I mean? But an awakening occurs. Political consciousness develops, political maturity occurs. And when you see that, and when you come to find out who Obama was and what he really represented, it just makes you like, you know what I mean? It makes you very frustrated. So for me, as an individual, but also maybe for many other black people in this country, us not showing up in 2016 to vote for the Democratic candidate in many ways was a referendum. That was our opportunity to voice our disapproval for the 8 years of the Obama administration. That was our opportunity to voice our displeasure for the fact that we have been ignored and left to suffer under Obama. That in this post-racialism that Obama supposedly recognized, we no longer matter and our cry no longer heard. So that was our silent protest. Us not showing up to the polls and us refusing to vote for any Democratic candidate or establishment candidate that they tried to shove down our throats. At least that's how it was for me. Maybe it was the same for you. All right, but let me go ahead and keep moving. All right, so we're talking about populism here tonight, and we're talking about attacks on populism. So it only makes sense that I, give a definition of what populism is and what it means. So I've went and found the most accessible definition I could find. I didn't want to go to a book of political theory to give you a definition of populism. I just Googled populism, and the first thing that popped up comes from the Oxford Dictionary. So you can all find this and access it yourself. But I'll read the definition. A noun, it's a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups, right? Uh, it's very simple. Like, is populism is something that appeals to the everyday man or woman, everyday woman or man. It appeals to the masses. It's populism because these so-called populist politicians support populist policies that are popular among the masses, right? The idea, like for Bernie Sanders being a populist candidate, the idea of what is it, Medicare or Medicaid for all, that's popular, right, among poor people because the majority of us are poor, right? The idea of free college, right, when we have so much debt hanging over us. These are popular. All these things are popular. But the 1% sees populist movements and populism, right, as an attack on their position, right? And you all know me, you know that I give African-centered analysis. So sometimes I really do try to stay away from using class terms. I am not an advocate of socialism. I think it's very good for me to start that. I am equally not an advocate of capitalism. I don't believe in getting stuck in this European binary trap because I believe that all ideas cannot escape the culture that produced them. So it's incumbent upon us as African people to develop our own ideas and solutions and not look for equal signs between Europe and Africa to say, oh, socialism is just equal to African communalism. Like, no, that's a lot of confusion. That being said, I will acknowledge that our black brothers and sisters on what's referred to as the political left, or our black Marxist brothers and sisters, oftentimes have some of the most effective critiques of capitalism. And I want to acknowledge that. I think that, reading Karl Marx comes in handy if you want to have a very thorough, see a very thorough critique of capitalism and why it's a bad system. But you can't get stuck at Marx. You got to continue to move over, right? You got to come to being African, because once you become to be African centered, then you not only can critique the capitalism, you can critique the socialism as well, because both of them rely on the domination. The whole modern industrial economy relies on the subjugation of the African world in order to exist. So I just went off on a tangent. I'm going to come back here because I want to stick to this presentation. But much love and respect to my brothers and sisters on the black left. Y'all know that I got respect for y'all. I think that ideologically, we just disagree in terms of solutions. But I do think in some ways we are trying to get to the same destination. All right, so I've given you the definition of populism. So let me go ahead and get started. So the dawn of American neoliberalism. So I'll start tonight I've already started. I'm giving y'all one of them Dr. John Henry Clark lectures where I've already been going in for an hour, 50 minutes as just the intro before we even gotten into the body of the presentation. But with that being said, I want to give you all the impetus for the current assault that we're seeing on populism, right? So this current assault has been going on for roughly about the last 40 to 50 years. And its cause was during the 60s, during the period of revolutionary struggle and mass participation and mass demands for the expansion of democratic participation. You saw increasing rights and expanding participation in the American government. And those who have a so-called class position to protect, those who have all the resources were affronted, by this movement and afraid of this particular movement, and rightly so, right? If you've stolen all the resources of the world and you see a mob, using their terminology, a mob of hungry people at your door, and you got all the food, it's nothing standing between you and that mob except the police or some form of security, right? So, rightly so, they're like, okay, we need to protect ourselves and give ourselves cover. So the current assault that we're seeing on populism is a response to the movement in the 60s where you saw increasing rights, right? The civil rights bills being passed, housing rights being passed, voting rights being passed, like just this expansion of rights and involvement in the government by so-called everyday people. And in response to that movement, in the 70s, you had what's referred to as a neoliberal movement develop. So if you study classical liberal theory, classical liberal theory can define in many ways, but really it can be summed up by four words. The four words in classical liberal theory that can sum it up very perfectly is that you have no rights, right? The only the and I'll get into that into more detail. But what I'm stating here, the impetus for the current assault on populism, because I think the framers of this particular government and constitution have been looking to put safeguards in place against populism, even when they were looking to create this so-called nation. But every cause, there's an effect. So you have these increasing rights, so the effect says you get this conservative movement that is born, and within this conservative movement it becomes kind of like the nucleus for advancing neoliberal policies and reforms. And why do you want to do this, right? One of the big talking points of the conservative movement is less government, or so they want to declaw the government. And what does that mean, right? If by chances the masses should ever get control of the government, we want to make sure that government is so impotent that it has no power to do anything to redistribute the stolen wealth. It has no power to claim the wealth that we have calcified and that we have accumulated and take and spread it out amongst these people, right? So they were, as the conservative movement is always attacking the government, right? Critical neoliberal policies. The government should, not be involved, in the economy at all, with the exception of, funding the military, which basically is to protect the interests of the property class, right? To protect and also to advance um, their markets, right? So the military is used to go into other places, to take resources, to colonize nations, and to make those resources available to the American business owners. So really what we have, and what we've always had, is a government that is for corporations, right? So this idea of corporations becoming people does not really sway too far from what this government really has always been in its essence, right? Even if you look at the development of the so-called colonies, many of the colonies, the original government of the colonies were corporations, right? Corporations were given a so-called corporate charter, right, from the sponsoring empire or nation, and via that corporate charter, they went and took control or colonized somebody's land, and it was the corporation who was the government, right? So there's a good movie on Netflix. The dude who I think his name might be Jason Momoa or Momoa. He's like a tall. He dates. I can't even think, but there's a series on Netflix that deals with it was this fur trading company. I can't even think of it, but this fur trading company, it came to America. Essentially, they were up in New England. They were, doing trade with the Native Americans. And this dude, he also played in Game of Thrones. He was who's the white girl with the all white hair? She rode the dragon. I'm losing it right now. But anyway, is Lisa Bonet? Yes, brother. He dates Lisa Bonet. He has he plays in a series on Netflix where he's essentially a mixed breed. He's a mixed Native American with European, and he's essentially going to war with the corporation who is essentially the government, right? So if you look back at the establishment of how colonies were set up, many of the colonies were founded by corporations, right? So this idea of corporate rule or oligarchy, right, rule by corporations is not something new. It's America really getting back to its roots, to its conservative roots, right, so to speak. But like I said, the impetus for this current assault on populism happened because you've seen the expanding rights that occurred during the 60s. And as a result, a conservative movement is born in the 70s that says, hey, we have to claw back government, right? Because if the masses should ever take control of the reins of government, we don't want government to be strong enough to do something to us or take something from us. So over the past 40, 50 years since 1970, this so-called conservative movement has been advancing neoliberal policy reforms for the purpose of weakening the government, right? Because they don't want a strong government, because a strong government is a threat to them and their resources, because a strong government might be subjected to popular rule, to democratic rule, or to populism. And if a popular candidate gets control of this government, then we are weak. So they've been working meticulously to weaken the government so that they could be strong in position to the government, right? Does that make sense to y'all? All right, let me take a sip of water. Keep on going here. So, okay, I was talking about classical liberal theory. I had said that, classical liberal theory can be defined in 4 words: you have no rights. So some classical liberal theoreticians, one Thomas Malthus, the other David Ricardo, of course, the one that everybody refers to is Adam Smith, the dude who wrote Wealth of Nations, where they all talk about, laissez-faire, meaning let it be, like, don't touch it, allow the so-called invisible hand of the economy to work, and if the government doesn't get involved, then the economy will reach market equilibrium on its own and everything will be perfect, right? So I'll read 2 quotes here that are really the embodiment of classical liberal thought, right? So classical liberal, right? Classical, neo just means new, right? So when they say neoliberal, they just mean the new liberal movement. But when you look at the classical, liberal theoreticians, like dudes like Thomas Malthus, he wrote an essay, or you can call it a book because it's long as hell, but it really was an essay. I think he wrote it in 1797. I talked about it on another presentation that I give. The name of that essay was an essay on population. And in this essay, here's a quote from the essay. He says, "A man who is born into a world possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents, on which he has a just demand, and if society do not want his labor, has no claim of right of the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast, there is no vacant cover for him. She shall tell him to be gone." Right. So what Thomas Malthus, if you Malthusian economics, what he's basically saying here is, hey, if you're born on this planet and your family is not a family of means, the only right that you have is the right to sell your labor. And if there is no demand for your labor, You don't have any right to the smallest portion of food. Like, you don't deserve to eat, is what he's saying. Right? If you read Thomas Malthus's essay on population, he's even so modern day conservatives, what they try to say is that, hey, the government shouldn't be the one serving the poor. We should get the government out of the way and allow charities and non-for-profits to serve the poor. That's why I'm always critical. Y'all have to be careful when they're putting these news stories out about these uber rich people doing stuff for people that the government should be doing. You understand what I'm saying? So I think what's the dude who played basketball for Golden State? Light skinned dude. He shoot a lot of 3-pointers. Y'all know him, Steph Curry. Steph Curry recently, there was a news article, a story came out that he and his wife is providing food for some of the students or children that are out of school, due to this COVID virus situation. I'm like, yeah, that's a nice act of charity, but that's something the government should be doing. You understand what I'm saying? Like, so you got to be very, very careful with this, because for Malthus, he was even against charity. He said, no, to give charity to give charity to the poor is he considered that shit damn near criminal. He said, if you give to the poor, you're only helping you're subsidizing poverty, so you're going to create more of it. Right. So in his mind, he says here, right in the sentence, he says, in fact, you don't have no business to be on this earth. Where he says no business to be where he is, he says, at nature's mighty feast, there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone. Right. So classical liberal, they're like, listen, just go away and die. And if you look historically at how Europeans dealt with poverty, what they essentially did was they criminalized poverty. Right. So, okay, they criminalized people for being poor. Right. They didn't have any way to deal with their poor. Right. So they imprisoned them. Right. But the solution became, during the colonization period, they're like, okay, we got all these new places to send our poor. Right. So we're going to send, our poor white trash, send them to America, send them to South Africa, send them to Australia, get rid of them. You understand what I'm saying? So, you go and you become an indentured servant, in one of their colonies. Right. So that becomes their plan for the poor. Go sell your labor to a corporation, and you become an indentured servant to that corporation for 10 years, and then you go and you get it how you live. But that was essentially their plan to deal with their poor. And then David Ricardo, he's another classical liberal theoretician. He says there is no way of keeping profits up but by keeping wages down. Right. So, like, again, the fundamental bedrock of neoliberal theory is that we as people have no rights. The only right that you have is the right to your labor, meaning the right to sell your labor. But if there is not a demand or a need for your labor, then you need to go away and die, essentially. And that's why, again, I'm gonna talk a lot tonight, so y'all just bear with me, because I'm gonna give y'all some gems and give y'all some things to think about. That's one of the reasons why I am hella critical of this neoliberal idea of universal basic income. Because what does that mean? It means that as we as a people, or as society, right, or as European society, because there are multiple societies, there's just not one. So, we all, the world across the globe is subjected to white minority rule right now. So until that is overthrown or defeated, I think that we're all subjected to white society, right? This concept of universal basic income, what does it mean? It means this. Let me tell you a story. When you are born on this earth, everything that you need to survive, you have. Why is that? Because the land and nature provide you with everything that you need to survive on this earth. If someone comes and they take possession of your land and they dispossess you of your land, they have taken away from you your means of survival. If you have no direct means of survival, then you have to find secondary means of survival. And that comes in the form of waged labor. You have to go and sell your labor to the people who now own the resources that were rightfully yours in order for you to access your resources, right? So what happens when, you know, economies transform and we get to this place called the so-called fourth industrial revolution, where there is no need for physical labor? Labor is not as significant a input into the modern economy as it once was. What do you do with all these devalued assets that you now have on your books? I don't no longer need all this labor, so what do I do with these people? Now, the neoliberals, right? You know, their liberal or humane way of dealing with it, right? In order to maintain or in order to sustain a system that is not sustainable, what they say is, let's give these people a slavery dividend. uh, Andrew Yang, or whatever his name was, he called it a freedom dividend, right? He says, we'll give Americans a slavery or a freedom dividend. We'll give them $1,000 a month just because, right? You know, America goes around this world raping the resources of people everywhere. And because you're American, you know, we'll pay you a dividend. You'll give you a share. Here's $1,000 a month just because. Why am I against that? I'm against that because what it's saying is that the resources of the world has been so consolidated and calcified into the hands of a few that the rest of the world has no way to survive under this current paradigm. So what should be done is those resources that have been claimed by the few should be reclaimed by those that have been dispossessed. And as I stated at the beginning of this presentation, the current global economy, the industrial economy, rests on the subjugation of the African continent. The entire global economy rests on Africans being dispossessed, right? So if we as African people reclaim Africa and reclaim our rightful state in this world, then it all comes to an end. It stops. You understand what I'm saying? But we can't take control of the reins to try to replicate their system. We have to create a system that is ours and comes from our culture. And the only way for us to do that is for us to practice our culture. But long story short, I'm against the universal basic income because I'm like, fuck no, I don't want your slavery dividend. You know, I've been dispossessed of my land. I want my land because if I have my land, I have my sovereignty, I have my freedom, I have my independence, and I have my means of survival. Now, when corporations and this small percentage of the world, when they control the land, we see what they do with it. They poison the water, they poison the air, they kill the food, and they spread disease. And then, you know, those who have controlled all of the goddamn resources, they go hide in their bunkers until motherfucking, you know, Elon Musk can build their ass as a colony somewhere on space where if you got, you know, $500,000, you can get a ticket to go live on this new colony since this way of life has now killed the earth and taken all the resources from the people. So hell no, we should all be against an idea of universal basic income because we should be against the status quo. And what universal basic income does is it preserves the status quo. It gives you a slavery drip. Here's a drip from the resources that we've stolen. Here's a drip, but at any point in time, we can cut off this drip and cut off your survival. So hell no, I don't want to live hand to mouth from those who have stolen all the resources. I want the goddamn resources. All right. So again, I'm just giving you what classical liberal theory is, but I've given you so much more in that particular slide. But again, you can't talk about classical liberal theory without talking about Adam Smith. You know, they refer to him sometimes as the father of capitalism. But when I say neoliberal versus classical liberal, so there were debates amongst classical liberals, but what the neoliberals do is they only take the parts of classical liberalism that uphold their worldview. And what is their worldview? More for me and none for you. You understand what I'm saying? So they don't take the parts of Adam Smith that contradict their new liberalism, right? This new liberalism is just the good parts of the old liberalism, and the good parts are the parts that validate and affirm my belief that if you were born with nothing, You should go somewhere and die. In fact, you shouldn't even be born. So people like Bill Gates, we're going to try to control the population and make sure that poor people are not reproducing because they are a burden and a threat to our resources. Right? This way of living is not sustainable. It's not in alignment with nature, so it cannot be maintained. Okay, but I'm going to. I'm going to read some quotes from Adam Smith. And the reason why I'm reading quotes from Adam Smith is because when these liberals bring up Adam Smith, and as Dr. Noam Chomsky likes to say, most people have only read the first paragraph of The Wealth of Nations. They haven't read the book. Just like most people have, if they read anything Marx, they've only read, his Communist Manifesto. They haven't read his critique on capitalism because it's multiple volumes. You understand what I'm saying? But if you read Adam Smith, you'll see some of the contradictions, right? In terms of these people who are neoliberals, right? Because they say, hey, government, has no place, in society. Government's role should be basically be military and to make sure that the markets operate effectively, right, for the landowners and the property class. I want to read a couple of quotes here from Adam Smith, just so that you can see that they only take the parts of classical liberal theory that uphold their worldview. So the first quote I'm going to read is from Adam Smith. It says, all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vow maxim of the masters of mankind. As soon as, therefore, as they could find a method of consuming the whole value of rents themselves, they had no disposition to share them with any other persons. Right? So that's one quote. You understand what I'm saying? I got a couple of other quotes from Adam Smith. He says, civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who've none at all. Next quote. He says, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which by far the greater part of the numbers are poor and miserable. Another quote. He says, it is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than that in proportion. So he's saying not only should the rich pay taxes, they should pay more than their fair share, right? And like, so, okay, another quote here. He says, wherever there is a great property, wherever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indignance of the many. So he's saying, put it in today's terms, for every billionaire, you have to have at least 1 million people living in extreme poverty for one billionaire to exist. Right? That was an arbitrary number, but I'm just saying, you have to, you get where he's coming from. And the last quote, he says, whenever the legislator attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its counselors are always the masters. What is he saying? He says, whenever the legislation is looking to pass policy to deal with the so-called, wealth gap or wealth inequality, the people who are advising the legislature are always those who have. So whose interests are they going to advise the legislature in? So I'll finish the quote here. He says, when the regulation, therefore, is in the favor of the workmen, it is always just and equitable. But it is sometimes otherwise when in favor of the masters. So he's saying, if by chance the legislators pass policy that favors the masses or the poor, then by its very nature, that's a just policy. He says, but if it's otherwise, then of course it's not just, right? If the legislation favors those who have over those who have not, then of course those who advise in their own favor. All right, you keep pushing here. All right, so the Powell memo. This is Supreme Court Justice Lewis F. Powell. Now, the Powell memo is very important. So write this down, and when you get a chance, go research the Powell memo. You can find a PDF of it and read the entire memorandum. But the Powell memo was written August 23rd, 1971. And again, it is a response to the growing rights and the growing involvement in government, right? The growing participation in democratic rule, or the growing democracy of America, right? So these people feel incredibly threatened, and no one event can kind of like point to the start of the so-called neoliberal period in America than this event right here, which is the Powell memo. So Lewis Powell, a Supreme Court justice, writes this memo, and he titles the memo "The Attack on American Free Enterprise System," i.e., the attack on capitalism, i.e., Americans are wanting more and more socialist government. They're wanting a government that does things for them. And Lewis Powell and other, capitalists and, mega, millionaires and billionaires, they see this as a threat, right? They see this growing populism in America as a threat. So he writes this memo, and in this memo, he speaks to every aspect of capitalist society and what needs to be done to effectively respond. So what I have here on this first page is just some quotes where he's talking about the role of media. Actually, I think here he's talking about the paradox of media and assisting and their own dethroning, right? Because the media is owned by the billionaire class. But let me read what he has here. He says, much of the media either voluntarily accords unique publicity to these attackers, or at least allows them to exploit the media for their purposes. This is especially true of television, which now plays such a predominant role in shaping the thinking, attitudes, and emotions of our people. Right? This is in 1970. He's saying, "Hey, television is an effective propaganda tool. Like, should we be so, laissez-faire with the programming, right? Because it plays such a significant role in shaping people's attitudes and the way that they think." He says, one of the bewildering paradoxes of our time is the extent to which the enterprise system tolerates, if not participates in, its own destruction. Most of the media, including the national TV systems, are owned and theoretically controlled by corporations, which depend upon profits and the enterprise system to survive. So he's saying that, hey, like, the media is owned by the corporations, but it's given a platform to these people who are attacking corporations. Does that make sense? Right. So this is what he's saying. So he gives some suggestions. He says, well, what can be done? He said, so right now I have a couple of excerpts from the document. I have one excerpt where he's saying, with the responsibility of the business executives, right, with the corporate leadership class. He says, well, what can we do about the pesky public? What can we do basically to adjust their attitudes and the way that they think and the things that they believe? And then he talks about the role of television in achieving these things. Right. So again, you can just Google the Powell memo and you can go and, find all these things for yourself. But okay, responsibility of business executives. He says, the overriding first need is for businessmen to recognize that the ultimate issue may be survival of what we call the free enterprise system, and all that this means for the strength and prosperity of American and the freedom of our people. Well, that should say of America and the freedom of our people. I'm sorry, I typed this myself because the Powell memo is actually in. It's like a screen print, like of like one of those old memographs. So I can't like copy and paste. I had to type it, but you can go read it for yourself. So he says, what can be done about the public? So when it comes to the public, he says, the first essential is to establish the staffs of eminent scholars, writers, and speakers who will do the thinking, the analysis, and the writing and the speaking. So what does that mean? He's saying when it comes to the public, we need to endow foundations such as the Heritage Foundation, such as the Brookings Institute. And the role of these foundations will be to uh, to make our ideas of liberalism plain and simple, so that the average person on the street can repeat them so seamlessly and not even know that they're our ideas. right? So he says, when it comes to television, he says the national television network should be monitored in the same way that textbooks should be kept under constant surveillance. This applies not merely to so-called educational programs, but to the daily news analysis, which so often includes the most insidious type of criticism of the enterprise system. So he's saying here, you know, how people get their news, the types of news that people are receiving, all of this should be controlled. He's saying, hey, we as corporations control it all, right? So we should make sure that the propaganda that people are receiving is going to be propaganda that is anti-populism and pro-us. I mean, you see this today on, the news channels like CNN and MSNBC, like they are it's so funny the way that it plays out, because when you understand like who owns them and who controls them, like that you can see them contradict themselves all the time, because they can't really say anything that is in the favor of the people, because they are there to control the people, keep the people asleep and keep the people moving in a direction that's against their own interests. So the Powell memo is important because it kicks off what's referred to as the neoliberal period in America. And again, like I said, neo meaning new, right? The new liberal period in America. And this period really can be classified by three distinct strains that really lead to one outcome: protection for the rich, dispossession of the poor. But the neoliberal period in America can be defined by privatization, militarization, and deregulation. Deregulation meaning less government involvement in things. So smaller government. Let's do away with the government. Militarization. Let's militarize. Let's, so you see our military budget. I hate saying our, you know what I mean, but you know what I mean. Like, and then privatization. The answer for everything is to privatize. Privatize education. Privatize healthcare. Privatize police, privatize fire departments. Why do I say this? Y'all remember? I think it was like last year, maybe a year and a half ago. You looked at this gives you a great example. There were all these wildfires that were occurring in California, and the public fire departments were under pressure because they didn't have enough resources to deal with all the fire. So what happened? The super rich started hiring their own private fire forces, right? So what happens in this situation when you have a limited amount of people who can fight fires, and now there's competition? You have the public and you have the private. Public firefighters, let's say they get $30 an hour. I'm sure they get more than that. Private firefighters, maybe they get $80 an hour. So who are all the firefighters going to go to? They're going to go to what pays them more, because again, they're enslaved by wages in the system. So they need wages in order to survive, because they don't have access to land. The only way to get access to land is to go into the wage economy to access resources that have been taken from you, right? So you saw, the very wealthy, the very rich, all of the Hollywood superstars were hiring their own private, firefighters to protect their properties from the wildfires. And I think that is a great example. But when it comes to neoliberalism, again, all you ever have to remember is three things: privatization, militarization, and deregulation. This is the push of neoliberal philosophy and the neoliberal policies in America. It's attempting to achieve these three things. All right, so this right here is very important, because if you look at who passed most of these policies that were expanding rights, these policies and stuff were passed by the new Democratic Party. And what do I mean by that? These parties will confuse you if you don't understand history, you don't understand context. Neely Fuller has a great quote that he says that if you don't understand racism, white supremacy, everything you think you understand will confuse you. Well, a lot of people are confused when it comes to these political parties. I mean, they really are, two wings of the same goddamn bird. But for some reason, and that bird, is like the chicken and we're the roach. They're left wing and the right wing of the chicken. Left wing is the Democratic Party, the right wing is the Republican Party, and the masses of the people is the fucking roach. And the chicken is representing the interests of other chickens. You understand what I'm saying? And we, right, the masses, ain't the goddamn chickens. But if you look at the party who passed these so-called democratic reforms, where they were expanding democracy and people's participation in people's rights, the Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it was the Democratic Party. But in the era of the neoliberal reform and assault on democracy and on populism, the Democratic Party had a complete bloodbath, right? All of the people who used to be in the Democratic Party fled the Democratic Party and went over to the Republican Party. So if you look at all the elections from 1969 basically up until 1985, so from 1969 really to 1992, every president, with the exception of one, was a Republican, because the Democratic Party has suffered a complete bloodbath. And like I said, at the start of the 70s, at the start of the neoliberal movement in America, um, the corporations had, regalvanized, and they had coalesced and came up with a strategy to really attack the public, and to basically all of the gains that were given during this period of democratic reform of the 60s, they found a way really to strip them all away. So even things like the Voting Rights Act today is like being challenged. You know what I mean? Voter suppression is significant in the U.S. I mean, even voting in and of itself is suspect if you truly believe, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, that these people are going to allow you to vote away their resources, like the resources that they've stolen, because they aren't their resources. But again, I said that the neoliberal period starts in 1970, and it goes on to the present. I mean, the present where we are, I mean, we're basically at the what Chris Hedges refers to as the last and final stage in capitalism, where America is really going to have to take off its mask eventually and reveal itself for the fascist state that it is, when neoliberal policies no longer work, and they can no longer use bread and circuses to keep the masses confused and disoriented. Eventually, they're just gonna have to show themselves to be a military state and tell you to go somewhere and starve. But okay, okay, that's all been covered. Oh, why did I cover that? Okay, this was an exchange that I had with a brother I respect, good brother. His name is Stephen Grant. We follow each other on Twitter. But this was back in November, and he had tweeted something out, and it just like caught me like, wow. And I'll read what he tweeted. He says, governments are wasteful, inefficient, and archaic. That's why the private sector will save the world. And when he having studied neoliberalism and having studied how they indoctrinate the masses, it just surprised me how effective they are at disseminating these ideas through the university and just through everything, so that when the public regurgitates them, we regurgitate it as if we came up with the idea. And I responded to him. I said, whoa. I said, we've been so saturated with neoliberalism over the last 40 years that when we repeat it back, it almost sounds like we came up with the idea ourselves. And his response was like, fam, what are you talking about? And I understand that response. Like, people have no idea what neoliberalism is. So like when you even use the word on Twitter, you sound like some highfalutin, like intellectual, like people are like, what the fuck are you talking about? What is neoliberalism? So I have a game here I want to play. We all know who this dude is. This is Milton Friedman. This is the disciple of American enterprise, right? This is one of when Lewis Powell said that we need to create a army basically of thinkers. He says the first essential thing is to establish the staffs of eminent scholars, writers, and speakers who will do the thinking, the analysis, the writing, and the speaking. Milton Friedman was one of their most popular scholars and proponents of neoliberal theory. So I have a game here. It's called Who Said It First? So was it Milton Friedman or was it Jay-Z? All right, so let's play. The first quote, it says, I think we need less government. So Milton Friedman or was it Jay-Z? Uh, put one in the chat if you think it was Jay-Z. Put two in the chat if you think that this quote is from Milton Friedman. I'm not gonna wait for y'all to do it. The obvious answer is like they both said it, at one point or the other. Milton Friedman definitely said all these things first, but these quotes are all from Jay-Z. So the quote the first quote that I have here comes from Jay-Z responding He had threw a fundraiser for Obama during the 2012 election, and when he was questioned about his support of Obama, one of his responses, this response, of course, I only took the part where he says, "I think we need less government," but you can go and find the entire quote. Um, the second quote here comes from, I think this was an article that was done in the New York Times, and it was Jay Z responding to his critique of Occupy Wall Street. And he was very critical of the Occupy Wall Street um, uh, movement for he said because they were not clear, and he wanted more clarity from them. But he ended his critique, and this is him being quoted. I believe this article came from the New York Times, but if you just Google Jay Z Occupy Wall Street, you can probably even Google this quote and you'll find it. He says, "This is free enterprise. This is what America is built on," right? So this, like, okay, I'll keep going. And the last quote, a lot of people listen to the NFL press conference that Jay Z did with Roger Goodell, and most people, took umbrage for the fact that Jay Z was entering into this relationship, and rightly so. I think that that's something that you can definitely be frustrated about. Give me 1 second, y'all. I'm gonna turn on the light behind me because the sun is starting to go down. So give me 1 second. Y'all can see I got my COVID-19 gear on. I haven't had a haircut in damn near a month. Been working from home for like the last 2.5 weeks. So I'm very comfortable. All right, but yeah, so most people took umbrage with, you know, Jay's involvement in this particular deal. But perhaps the most revealing thing that he said in this entire press conference was this following quote. And I know it went over a lot of people's heads because, again, a lot of people don't have no idea what neoliberalism is. A lot of people respond like, the good brother Steph, when you even mention it, they like, what the fuck are you talking about? But Jay, during the presentation or during the press conference, he says, private citizens for me, with everything that's going on in this country, private citizens are the ones that's going to have to push things forward, working together like we do with reform. If you look at reform, when he says we, reform is an organization of hedge fund billionaires, modern day robber barons who are working together in their private meetings to develop legislation and then push that legislation through the government. That's a subversion of democracy. But Jay Z says that this is going to be the answer. He says we're not relying on government to do it. Let's take this group of people and let's introduce these bills slash legislation and see what we can do. Right? That's an incredibly neoliberal like point of view. But again, Jay Z has been courted by as an entertainer. Entertainers represent a special class in democracy because all democracies rely on bread and circus in order to herd the masses, and the entertainers play the circus function. So entertainers are very useful. So as a result, Jay Z has been being courted by corporate America ever since, I don't know if I want to say what was his coming out party was when he took Oprah to Brooklyn to have a quarter water on the steps, or if it was when he had the one-on-one with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. But either way, corporate America has been courting Jay Z for some time. I mean, even his charity work in Africa when he did that that situation in the water in Africa. If you know who that was done through, it was done through a UN organization. So like the globalists and they've been courting him for a long time. I have sometimes I hold out hope for Jay because I'm such a big fan of his music that maybe one day he'll come across one of my lectures and this shit'll wake his ass up. But as of right now, and they got him and they got him good. And whatever. Let me keep on moving here. So I just did the who said it first. All right. So uh the Powell memo talked about the need for the corporate class to really, consolidate its control over media. And this was just an article. I put these slides together 2 weeks ago. I believe this one article came from Forbes, that it was just talking about America's media today is like everything you see here on any channel is owned by 15 billionaires, right? Um, and this particular slide, I wish I had. I forget the source of this one. I'm sorry, y'all. Again, I put this presentation together a couple weeks ago, but this was a good clip that I found. You probably can find it if you just Google the illusion of choice. This one was from 2011, though, and it basically stated that 90% of America's news is owned by six media giants, right? So if you look like GE, Viacom, and Time Warner, or CBS, like, you know, everything that we hear and see is coming from this billionaire class. And Noam Chomsky wrote a good essay. I believe this essay was written in 1998. It's called "What Makes Mainstream Media Mainstream." And I have a couple of excerpts here from the essay. He says, "Say you are a reporter writing a story on Southeast Asia or Africa or something like that. You're supposed to go over to the big university and find an expert who will tell you what to write. Or else go to one of the foundations like Brookings Institute or American Enterprise Institute, and they will give you the words to say. These outside institutions are very similar to the media." He says, "There are all sorts of filtering devices to get rid of people who are pain in the neck and think independently. Those of you who have been through college know that the educational system is very highly geared to rewarding conformity and obedience. If you don't do that, you are a troublemaker. So it is kind of a filtering device which ends up with people who really honestly, they aren't lying, internalize the framework of belief and attitudes of the surrounding power system in the society." Right? So he's saying that the function of mainstream media is to indoctrinate essentially the masses and ensure that the masses believe that the interests of those who have stolen all the resources is the same interest of those who have had all the resources dispossessed of them. And he says here that, like, they have this filtering essentially process where if you don't conform to their way of thinking or way of speaking, you don't get the platform. So it's like when you look across all of the liberal platforms and everybody is using the same exact talking points. This is why. Hold on one second. I just got a text message here. All right, got it. This is actually my wife. She's upstairs. She was asking me when can she cook dinner. She gonna be mad at me because I had 20 missed text messages. All right. Y'all know we all quarantined in the house, right? So my kids and family. Hold on. Responding to my wife. I'm sorry, y'all. I appreciate y'all holding in there with me. All right. I apologize. I had like 20 text messages here, but I had my phone on silent. Um, so, uh, so what makes the mainstream media mainstream? Again, this was Noam Chomsky, and I already read it, but this was him just basically showing the vetting process so that you get an understanding that everybody that you see on your screen is really pushing an agenda of someone, and they're pushing the agenda of the corporations that own them. All right, so okay, this is important. 1993, the election of Bill Clinton. So what people refer to as the Clinton Democrats, or this 1993 is where we see the emergence of the so-called New Democrats. And why is this important? I was showing you here how from 1969 to 1992, the Democrats took a bloodbath. They could not run a candidate that would be electable. The only way for them to get a candidate that would be electable was to create a new type of Democrat. And what you see, what happens here with Clinton, and a lot of people don't realize this, what Clinton tried to do with his candidacy and also with his presidency was to reclaim many of the Democrats who had left the racist Democratic Party and went over to the Republican Party after the 60s, right, during that Democratic Party bloodbath. And in order to do this, they call it, he governed from the center. But what it really means is that the Democratic Party became no different than a Republican Party. But as I always told you, they always were that way. So when you look at the so-called centrist or pragmatic policies that Bill Clinton passed, he passed policies to signal to racist whites in America that the time of handouts or gimmies to black people was over. Like everything about his candidacy was meant to signify that, but also to further neoliberalism, right? So if you look at his key legislative accomplishments, welfare reform, the idea of the welfare queen, the crime bill, the idea of the savage black youths, NAFTA, sending jobs that were, I guess, and I'm okay. I'm not okay. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but if you look at NAFTA, it's kind of it's a sweet irony there. And what do I mean by that? When our ancestors, black people in this country, when they migrated from the South to the cities, the factories used to be in the cities. Well, what this racist ass government did, you see white flight and economic flight, right? So the cities essentially became traps, and the factories that were there then left and went to the suburbs. You understand what I'm saying? So now all the jobs were like essentially in the suburbs, and then eventually when NAFTA passes, now they leave the suburbs and they go out of the country, so they go to where cheap forms of labor are. And what that does is it just serves to decrease the cost of labor across the globe, right? So it depresses wages everywhere, right? Because now it's a buyer's market, right? It's an employer's market, not a employee's market, which is really always the case. But like I said, if you look at his key pieces of legislation, Wall Street deregulation, he passed the bill. I can't even think of it right now, but the bill was originally passed in 1933, after the market crash, right, the so-called Great Depression. They passed a bill that did not allow banks to banks that were commercial banks that basically held, your private loan, your private, savings and your checkings, could not engage in the behavior of banks that were investment banks that were involved in speculation and all these risky things. Clinton basically said, nah, Wall Street owns me, so I'm gonna go ahead and do away with that law. He deregulated, and he declawed many of the government entities. So the Food and Drug Administration. So it's so funny. People always talk about so much goodness that came out of the Clinton years. But Clinton left office in 2000, and his chickens came home to roost in the 2000s. You look now and you see an opioid crisis, you see a housing crisis, you see a financial crisis, all or so-called banking crisis. All these things can literally be traced to policies of the Clinton administration. But either way, that's neither here nor there. Let me keep getting into the presentation. Uh, what happens is with these new so-called Clinton Democrats or new Democrats, now the American electorate has the illusion of choice. Once upon a time, people were under the illusion that the Democratic Party represented the interests of the small people, of the little guy. They were fighting for the everyday person. But truly, what you have with the emergence of the new Democrats is you have uh, you essentially get to a situation where you have two parties that are both pursuing different. Thank you for posting that. The Glass Steagall Act. Yes, that's correct. You have two parties who are bothly pursuing different aspects of neoliberal policy. So the Democratic Party becomes a party that is really solely concerned with protecting Wall Street and increasing market gains for Wall Street, and the Republican Party is concerned with shrinking the size of government and limiting, the involvement of government in the economy. Right. So the only bailouts essentially are bailouts for the rich. Okay. All right. So listen, I'm at an hour and 45 minutes here. I think I started this presentation at 5 o'clock, and it's now 6:45. And like I said, I had about 20 messages here for the what from the wife. So I'm gonna I'll make this. I'll do a part two, but I think that I've given y'all a really solid part one. As you can see, I'm on slide 23 out of 72 slides. But part two, when we come back, let me go to the beginning of the presentation. I told y'all that I was dealing with, I gave my opening remarks. I also wanted to cover the dawn of American neoliberalism, which kind of like really showed the emergence of these new so-called Clinton Democrats, your illusion of choice. So next, what I'm going to cover the Hamilton Project. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the concept of Goldman Democrats, and I'm going to finish by just giving y'all alternatives to voting. That's not going to happen today because, like I said, I've already been going for an hour and 45 minutes. So what I want to do is give y'all time to consume what's already been presented. So when I come back to do part two, I'll let y'all know when we're going to do part two. But when I come back to do part two, if you have any questions, you can ask your questions. You can always email me questions or email me to ask questions about where I got the uh, sources from. Again, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the slides, I'll make them available for $10. If you want to support my Strike Drum lecture series, oh, peace, brother Shaka Ra. You there, brother? All right, I saw brother Shaka Ra just joined in the. But yeah, listen. If you want to support the Strike Drum lecture series, you can purchase that as well. But I'm gonna come back and I'll do a part two of this lecture to give y'all more information. But please, just go and research the things I presented to you. Listen to this, over again. If you have questions, you can even ask your questions now in the chat. I'll take a couple minutes here to just to take some questions before I close out and we come back and do a part two. I saw my brother Shaka Raj just join. Um, one second here. How do I make this bigger? Peace, brother Shaka Ra.
What the hell?
All right. All right. All right. Anybody in the chat got any questions? Y'all will get a good part too. I think I just gave a lot of good information. A lot of good information just to get y'all started. So,
Mic check, mic check.
yeah, brother Shock, I can hear you, brother. I can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. Yeah, bro. As always, very informative presentation, very insightful. I admire the brevity of your sources. As always, I don't know. It's like you must, and I admire it more because of the fact that you have like two children.
Three,
Like,
three.
sorry, three. I forgot. Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
So like, where you're finding this level of time to be reading, it's a
Well, right now I'm about to pay for this because it was some miscommunication between me and the wife. I didn't see all
I,
those texts. So
I know how that goes, bro. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I ain't planning to hold you too long. You know what I mean? We wanna keep the black family together.
No, true and true
but
indeed. True indeed. True
but
indeed.
but yeah, just in terms of keeping it brief, there's so much that you said that we could touch on. I want to share an observation though and get your take on it.
Mhm.
I do tend to watch a lot of American news. Yeah, just to keep in touch with Wagwan in the belly of the beast, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, and following this election has been an interesting one. Now, when under Obama, it's a weird shift of kind of focus that I've done. Under Obama, I was watching a whole heap of Fox News. Kind of, because I figured, well, whatever Fox News is saying, I can basically,
Hmm.
judge what the rest of them are saying from that trajectory, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
But since Trump, I've kind of shifted towards watching a lot more what they call progressive news. Yeah, so like the Young Turks, and well, this one's not necessarily progressive, but Roland Martin. Yeah, right. So, and what has struck me is that the extent to which the the black electorate appears in America to be very establishment. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by that, what I mean, I'm no major support. Like over here, we had a similar situation in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, yeah,
Hmm.
who was a Labour Party candidate, but he was a bit more left of left, and a lot of black people were excited about that. But he lost the election, yeah,
Hmm.
recently. And I noticed that there's two contradictions I noticed. One over here, like black people in the quote unquote conscious community who, you know, you barely found them supporting political activity within the conscious community, but suddenly found themselves as major advocates for Jeremy Corbyn, right? In the
Yeah.
wake of his candidacy, right? And I've seen something similar to that in relation to Bernie Sanders. But what has struck me is that the very loud anti-Bernie black voice, yeah, which I wouldn't mind, except for that it's coming from a very establishment centrist position. It seems,
Yeah.
all right. And so just using Roland Martin as an example of this, like I kind of provokingly sent him a couple of tweets saying, yeah, it would be interesting for you to get like Jared Ball, and
I
Glenn
saw that. I
Ford,
saw. I saw that tweet.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
on of Black Agenda report
Hmm.
on your panel, because he doesn't seem to feature those kinds of voices, right?
Hmm.
The closest you get is Greg Carr, yeah, to that
Yeah.
kind of a voice. He knows the tradition and that kind of stuff, right?
Well, yeah. When I said earlier in the presentation about African centered scholars who I deeply respect, when it comes to that, but on the political side, like I discount a great deal. I was referring to Baba, my big brother, Greg Carr, when I
Okay,
said when
okay,
I
okay.
when I said that, because I think, when it comes to African centered scholarship, hands down, like he's one of our most well versed and most respected scholars. But sometimes his political analysis leaves much uh, to be desired, and it's funny sometimes because I do recognize that sometimes with age we get a bit more conservative in our worldview, but I'm someone who studies and reads a lot of Du Bois, and he was the complete opposite. It's like with age he got more radical, not less radical. But again, there's a lot of nuance to be said in the position that Dr. Greg Carr offers versus like where I stand. So it's definitely a conversation I'm always willing to entertain. But we had a good panel discussion last year on our sister African Esquire's channel, just about about voting. I think that may have been in 2018. So Greg Carr was on that panel with us, and he was talking about he's a proponent of voting. He's a proponent of by any means necessary, is what he
Yeah,
referred to it as.
yeah,
And I was, completely anti. At least that's the position that I took at that point.
mhm,
But to answer your question about, I do think that you have diagnosed it appropriately with the black voters in this country. The majority are very establishment and centrist in their world view. And I found it a little humorous when you talked about asking Roland Martin to bring on like a Jared Ball or folks from the black left to engage them, because I just thought about some of Michael Eric Dyson's debates with folks on the black left and how like they mop.
it's embarrassing.
Yeah, embarrassing. I mean, I don't. And Roland Martin wasn't even capable of debating a white nationalist because he's so centrist and so democratic establishment in his thinking that a white nationalist came on his show, Richard Spencer, and like mopped the floor with him, which was very embarrassing. But again, it goes back to if you think about the Powell memo, and it talks about who gets platformed on media. I think at the end of the day, Roland still wants to have credibility with mainstream media. So he's not going to platform certain voices because he wants his platform to be seen as credible. So he's not going to bring anybody that deviates too far from the norm. And he himself, no matter how many dashikis he puts on, and, respect to Roland, no disrespect to him, but he himself is not going to, sway too far from the Democratic plantation. Now, in terms of historically, what you see here, like in the U.S., I think first you have to acknowledge that there's a segmentation of black voters, right? When you look at black young people, it seemed in this election, black young people were very supportive of Bernie Sanders and his policies, and I understand
Yeah.
why. But when it comes to many of our elders, like I think Carolina, call it the Whip Claibornes of the world. Like we look at many of our elders down in the Bible Belt, you have to understand the history there. Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book. I think the book was he wrote, actually multiple volumes. It's called American Dilemma. But in that book, he talks about uh, the politics of black people that he studied, and what he pointed out was that there is a democratic machinery, a well-oiled machinery that exists within the black community that has a tight grip on our politics. It controls many of our institutions. And what you see occurring coming out of the 60s is much of the grassroots movement and grassroots energy and organizations that we had as black people in this particular country, when those things were disbanded and dismantled, all of that energy was then transferred into the Democratic Party. So you have a generation of black folks who are Democratic Party loyalists, right? So for them, they would not even consider a Bernie Sanders candidate because their loyalty is not to any particular candidate. Their
But to the
loyalty
party.
is to the Democratic Party. So whoever
Certainly.
the party chooses as their candidate and signals through their corporate media that this is who the party endorses, then that's who those black folks are going to vote for. And it's unfortunate. I had an exchange with my sister Nadeg, from down in Haiti, because I had posted something on my Twitter about the so-called Negro firewall that exists in American politicians is full of the types where Malcolm X referred to. You got the enslaved person who, when the master's house is on fire, they go get a bucket of water, and then you got the one that when the master's house is on fire, they pray for a strong gush of wind. And the types of people you see on the Democratic establishment, you know, this populist movement that's happening in America on the left represents a threat to the Democratic establishment, meaning the Democratic Party's house is on fire. So you
Yes,
see
sir.
this class of black people going to get buckets of water to protect, the Democratic Party from any onslaught from progressivism or populism. But my sister Nadag, she challenged me, and she raised the point which I agree with. She said to me, do you really believe that black people, meaning the Democratic Party loyalists, were able to stop Bernie and hold up hold up what's this dude name? What's Joe the Bigot? Jim
Yeah,
Crow Joe?
Biden.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
Joe Biden, Jim Crow Joe. Do you really
Yeah.
think black people were able to uphold Jim Crow Joe? And she said, if you really think that the results of those elections are not manipulated so that their candidate wins anyway, the narrative that they're telling to the public is that, yeah, the black vote saved us. But she's like, behind the scenes, what really occurred is that, like, it doesn't matter how many votes that we want, it don't matter how many of us participate. Who they want to win is going to win. We saw that in 2001 with George Bush. There's going to be some voting counting scandal, and I think with technology, is a lot easier to manipulate an electronic ballot today than it was back in 2001. So those who control, right, the wills of democracy are going to make it so that their candidate wins no matter what. So, and that's the presentation that I'm giving tonight. Like, I'm showing these details, but more importantly, like, I'm like, listen, I didn't think it was smart for us to run into a burning house, so I damn sure don't think it's smart to run into one that's about to collapse, right? So with that being said, like, fuck a political party to engage in their system. We need political organizations to prepare us, right, for the collapse of this system and for the neo America that will emerge, which will be America that is really outright fascist. And I'm going to get into all of that in my presentation, but like, I think that this is what black people need to be worried about. But again, our minds are being controlled and manipulated. Um, by these platforms. Like, black people get their sources of news and media from the same place that other people in the society get it from. So while in the 60s you had a situation where the grassroots were able to crown our own leaders to some extent, because the establishment still gave us leaders like the kings of the world, but the grassroots, we were able to get leaders that emerged and were given a platform. Now true grassroots leaders that are working in the community and that help have alternative world views will never be given a platform because they don't want the masses of people to hear what we have to say.
Mm. Yeah, man. No, appreciate that response. I noticed this defense of the Democratic Party, and like, when I first heard it, I thought it was weird, especially that there were a number of people, one sister in particular on Roland Martin show, that her primary critique of Bernie was that he's not a Democrat. That's how the hell what, right? But then when you talk about the demographics and a lot of the young people being for Bernie's politics and these kinds of things, the idea is also that the young people didn't vote, and so there is this narrative that the young black people who supported Bernie Sanders were getting at their elders for not voting for him. And in response, some of the elders, Roland included, kind of got at the youth, them saying, "Well, get out and vote," kind of thing. And it's this holy grail that we consider voting to be,
Hmm.
this uncritical analysis that we have. And to be honest with you, I find a lot of the politics around voting to be lazy. But I also find a lot of anti-Trumpism to be lazy as well. I think anti-Trumpism is, and even anti-Boris Johnsonism, if we apply it to the UK, is really a reaction to these particular heads of state, so to speak, offending our better held illusions about the countries in which we live. You know,
Exactly.
what I'm saying. So, Boris makes it less comfortable to be a Negro in London. So we're gonna make Boris Johnson the problem. You
Yeah,
know.
I agree with you wholeheartedly in terms of like the so-called anti-Trump movement. So it's the same thing. It is very lazy. It wants to deal with symptoms. It does not want to deal with like the root cause. It wants to point to individuals, right? So all of society is pointing to Trump as the thing that's wrong with America, when Trump is a product of all that is what's wrong with America. But also, so is Obama. You understand what I'm saying? Like, so,
Yep.
and I'm going to get in, I'm really going to get into that in a lot more detail in the next presentation. But what's really sad is that our, as a people, our trust and belief in the status quo, right, our trust and belief that things as they exist today are going to exist this way in the future, our kind of like sense of childlike dependency that, hey, we don't have to worry about these serious problems in the world because, and I'm being facetious here, but we don't got to worry about these problems in the world because the white man is going to worry about them for us. Like, it angers me because what happens is the range of discussion that we even entertain as a people is limited and subjected to what's accepted by mainstream discourse. You know what I mean? So like, I want to take this moment to give a big shout out to all of my friends who teach at universities, who have the courage to invite someone like me to even come on campus and speak, because folks like me who are saying things like stuff that I'm saying and using you know uh, sources to support it, like, we ain't getting no platforms. They don't want us talking to black people.
Yes, sir. No, totally, totally. You know what I'm saying? On your the Russian bot thing,
Hmm.
because I've heard and I will say no names, but I have heard respected scholars and activists put forward this Russian bot thing in relation to a number of different things, including ADOS.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought it was most unfortunate, right? But and essentially for similar reasons that you're talking about it, but for me, mostly it because a significant aspect of at least the open ADOS narrative was critical of the Democratic Party. Some of that narrative from coming from Black people seemed to be.
You there, brother Shaka? I can't hear you if you're there. Brother Shaka Ra, I may have lost you, brother. Give you well, it looks like you're still here. I just can't hear you. I hear you talking. I hear movement in your background now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Where did I cut out?
You said about the Russian bots and even how it was used to critique ADOS. You there, brother?
Hello, hello.
Yeah, I'm. All right, I hear you now.
Yeah. Right, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so so yeah, it was used to critique ADOS or to create the idea that ADOS was a Russian bot kind of,
Hmm.
establishment. But essentially the reason for that was again anti-Trumpism and a bit of a defense for
The
seemed to
Democratic
be
Party
the
and and
Democratic Party.
and a black assault on the Democratic Party. That's why even in my critiques of ADOS, and I had many, I never wrote them off as like Russian bots because I just felt that that was like just so. Uh, just I felt that although the leadership of ADOS was reactionary and was capitalizing on what Dr. Greg Carr always calls weaponized ignorance, I felt that
Mhm.
the underlying sentiment and what the people who were being attracted to ADOS um, were displeased with was something that was very real and genuine.
Yes, sir.
You understand what
Yes,
I'm saying? So I
sir.
never wrote them off as Russian bots. And I was even critical of some of our elders who like tried to do that because, like I said,
Mm.
the Russian bot like thing really insults like our intelligence. And right now, it really has just become a firewall excuse for the establishment to use to write off any type of populist movement, to say, oh, this thing is like this is the Russians. So and I have some of that in the second part of the presentation, but I shared my screen here because when you were talking about the vote and how Black America's use of the vote, this was a tweet that I sent out. When did I send this? November the 6th, 2018. So that was 2 years after the election. And I guess this was a mid-year, a midterm, and I said, so-called Black Americans are American in the religious sense, not a national one. Black people in America are dedicated believers to the idea of America, and
Mm.
thus voting is merely a collective form of communism. And then the tweet under it says, with this ballot, we partake in the flesh of our dead ancestors who died for our right to vote. In the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Amen. So I'm being facetious here, but like even beneath the jokes, there's an element of truth, and I think that kind of like this is where our politics as a people, of course, different segments of us have different politics, but for the most part, um, older black folks, and I don't want to say older black folk, not all, because
Yeah,
I'm in the community. I'm at the
yeah,
Maleficate
definitely.
Asante Institute quite frequently, and a lot of our
Mm.
elders who were activists are still activists. A
Yes,
lot
sir.
of
Yes.
our elders from like in Cobra, like so. I don't want to make this a generational thing, and I
Yes, sir.
don't
Yes,
want to
sir.
seem like I'm attacking my elders. You understand what I'm
Yes,
saying?
sir. Yes,
So
sir.
I'm just saying that the Democratic Party loyalists tend to be of a certain age and certain generation. So there's two types.
Mm.
There's the Democratic Party loyalists and there's the
Mm.
Democratic Party careerists. And the
Right.
Carreras is basically the young, new black, or blue check black people who, for them, they see the economic benefit and hurting masses of black people to support the democratic establishment. By them serving as like the face of the intermediary between us, it gives between the Democratic Party and the black populace, it gives them access to resources, opportunities, and more importantly, the very wealthy Democratic Party donor base. So if you look at all these
Mm-hmm.
black people, and I'm talking about the younger black people who are so staunchly, Democratic Party establishment. Like the Bakari Sellers of the world, like they're
Yes, yeah.
also very pro Israel. They're pro capitalism. Like they, have this mind. Like they're very anti. They're anti whatever the establishment is anti. So it's like I don't even take them serious because they're such political prostitutes. And I,
Yes,
I
yes,
think in terms of like an intermediate generation, I don't think nobody embodies political prostitution more so than Michael Eric Dyson. You know what I mean? Like his
yes.
his mouth is always for sale. You understand what I'm saying? So like that.
The good Reverend Owl was competing for that position
Oh
for a
well, yeah,
while.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. I, ain't- I'm not gonna be a. You know what, Reverend Al, I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I'm gonna let go. I'm gonna let Al go somewhere, crawl away into a hole. I ain't gonna say
Yeah,
nothing
you
about
know.
it, but like,
No, and that's the
yeah.
thing because I for his out there-ness on issues of police brutality, I have held some respect for him in that
No,
regard.
I think I think even in those he was, capitalizing and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear that. I hear that. You know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
yeah.
But it was useful at points, in terms of
True, true. He
the
did.
the
He
media onslaught.
brought some light to
Yeah,
some.
you know what I'm saying. Finally, though, 'cause I know you gotta go. Yeah, I don't want to hold you up. You know what I'm saying. You want to keep the queen happy. But the I want to see what your thoughts on this because you mentioned Martin Luther King
Hmm.
and pushing the people that the grassroots pushing the people that the system gives us to different positions. Now, if we was to hear Baba Kwame Ture tell the story,
Hmm.
uh, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had a significant influence on the development of Martin Luther King in his latter years,
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
he started to speak some different words. You know what I'm saying? And at that point, incidentally, he lost the support of all of his, well, most of his friends in higher places, including the black church. Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
to a significant degree. And I'm just putting this in context to get your thoughts on it because you did mention about him being among those who was given to us. But I think it's important because of knowing the learning trajectory that movement activism and movement leadership, the learning trajectory that it takes you on. I do think it's always right to do justice to Martin Luther King's name,
Yeah,
even when we
absolutely.
disagree
Yeah,
with his
yeah.
politics.
I agree with you wholeheartedly there.
Mhm.
So I do hold a deep deal of respect for Martin Luther King, for obvious reasons. And even when we pour libations, I'll still say his name. Like he's someone
Yes, sir.
who's definitely deserving of honor. And if you came to uh, so during the Strike Drum lecture series, I gave a lecture that dealt with the African world struggle within the context of the Cold War.
Hmm.
And in that lecture, I deal a lot with Dr. Martin Luther King, and
Right, right,
his
right.
kind of like awakening and his
Hmm.
abandoning of elitists, of the establishment worldview.
Hmm.
So I understand. We're all products of our time. You know what I mean? And we all come into enlightenment or consciousness from different avenues. So I cannot be judgmental in that regard. But when it comes to ideology and when it comes to how certain individuals, because this whole struggle is happening within a context, right? So understanding the maneuvers that are happening on the chessboard, I think is important for us to be able to identify how certain people were maneuvered and used against us, even if
Yes,
some of
sir.
those people like we have deep respect for. So I think when we do it, we have to temper our critique,
Yes, sir.
by the fact that sometimes our ignorance can be used against us. Um,
Yes,
but
sir. Yes, sir.
but also, one of my sayings is that I try not to carry forward conflicts between our ancestors, right? So, like, as a Garveyite, there are lots of Garveyites who, like, who want to carry forward the conflict between Du Bois and Garvey. But I
Mm,
think that there are elements where Garvey was incorrect, and there are plenty of elements where Du Bois was incorrect. But either
mm,
way, when you're a broken people, you have to take the fragments of what work in order to build and make yourself whole again. So you can't
mm,
completely write off anyone's contributions. You have to study the entirety of it,
mm,
um, and you have to understand what people's underlying assumptions were, right?
mm,
Because that means if you have the same underlying assumptions today that they had 100 years ago, and enough has already occurred to prove their assumptions either wrong or right, that's why we revere Malcolm the way that we do, is because his analysis has proven the test of time. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I think that that's what's important. Like, who had a proper analysis, and what's baked into your analysis is a certain level of assumption, right? But over time, your assumptions get proved right or wrong, right? You develop a theory and then you test it, right? And if you test it and your theory is inappropriate, then you adjust, you modify, you do something differently. But what we've done as a people is, like, we've kept the same theory and the same tactics and haven't adjusted it. And it's like they say, you do insanity is doing something the same way expecting a different result. Like, I think that we've gone insane with some of these tactics that we use, and I think voting is one of them. So all right, so I'm at 7:16. I'm gonna close out here, brother Shaka Ra. I'll give you the final word, brother, and I'm gonna close out. Peace to the chat. Peace to everybody for joining. If you follow me on Twitter, um, definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I'll give y'all a part two to this presentation uh, as soon as I can. I gotta clear it with the wife. All right, peace, brother Shaka Ra. You want to say anything in closing? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close out, brother Shakara. Appreciate you joining me, brother. Um, and peace to the chat.